Folks, thank you again for joining us. With us today, the living legend himself, Miller Time, Jonathan Miller, the CEO of Miller Samuels, an appraisal company that everyone in the industry knows. He's been writing the appraisal reports and market reports for Douglas Elliman for a very long time.
1994.
1994. I was alive during that time, but I was young.
Yes, you were in diapers, I think.
Yes, yeah. Still. And so he's here with us to talk about the market, where we are, if people should cry, and how long they should cry for. So,
right.
Thank you for coming on.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah.
Anywhere I can talk to people and not talk to my family about the market, they're very thankful.
This is a safe place for you here.
Good.
And so you can
We're a
talk.
support group.
Yeah, exactly.
Good.
Markets.
Yeah.
We're all here to
I
support
appreciate
each
it.
other.
Every family is probably so sick of it at home, like just coming home. You have no idea how bad it is out there.
Absolutely. That's
terrible.
the story of my life.
I know. I guess let's start with what is happening out there. What are you seeing? Tell us everything.
Well, I usually start just to get the conversation rolling. It's a black hole we're going to fall into. We're all going to die. But I'm not going to use that. I'm going to go and say it's actually a bit more optimistic.
Ooh, okay.
Right. Which is I think normally in any housing cycle you have an adverse external event like rates spike at the steepest rate in 4 decades, and so you have a slowdown in sales. Right? Because it's less affordable, right? And then what normally happens is inventory piles to the sky because properties aren't selling. And then that's where you have new price discovery, where the greater inventory brings down prices, improves affordability. In the beginning of this year, I dubbed, it's borderline a dad joke, but I basically dubbed 2023 is the year of disappointment, because sellers aren't going to get the 2021 price necessarily, but buyers aren't going to see big discounts. And the reason for that is that instead of inventory piling to the sky nationally, and I cover about 50 housing markets around the US for basically Douglas Elliman's footprint, it's the same everywhere in the sense that inventory is unusually low. And in fact, new inventory coming into the market is falling. Why? Because rates have jumped so much. So, if you refinanced at 3% 30-year fixed, are you going to sell your house and become a 7.5%, get a 7.5% loan? Probably not. You will eventually, as personal needs, like you're in a 1-bedroom and you have triplets. Right. I mean, or you get relocated and your commute became an hour and a half instead of 20 minutes. All those things sort of build pressure over time. And we've already been 18 months in. So that's sort of the state of, up to now where we seem to be going.
How does the rental market, if it does, affect the sales market right now? Because there's this sort of separate sort of theme about the rental market and rental prices being so high. How does that sort of interact in any way with the sales market?
Well, what it did until the summer was when people were being priced out of the purchase market, they moved into the rental market they camped out. It's temporary. But it was already relatively tight. I mean, people have been complaining about rent in New York City for 150 years, if not more. So it made a tight market tighter, made rents higher, and rents actually peaked this summer. But the last several months, rents have been coming off. Even though that's a seasonal decline, they're falling greater than I would expect for a seasonal decline. So I think we're getting some relief. However, I don't think that we're going to see a correction in rents, because the economy, even though it's weakening sort of at a glacial pace, it's still vibrant, pretty strong. Nationally, unemployment's at 3.8%. I mean, that's astounding. During the last recession, it was 10. Do we want to hope for greater unemployment? I don't think so.
Right.
So it is strange. I think the theme for everything here is it's confusing because sort of the old rules of thumb don't really seem to apply. And so everybody's a little confused about where we're going.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I feel like a lot of our sellers are waiting for a seller's market, and our buyers are waiting for a buyer's market. Do you think there's going to be a price correction in terms of listing prices? Do you think at some point there'll be a shift?
So I think it's happening a little bit in slow motion, where pricing is getting a little bit better, but it's still wrong for most part. That sellers are, it takes. I've learned through my own experiences that it takes 12 to 24 months for sellers to adjust pricing to market levels and not feel like they left something on the table. And I think we're sort of in the middle of this. So I think a lot of the new product that has come on is priced too high as a general rule. And buyers are looking at, a 7.5% mortgage rate. So, I think many buyers figure, I'll refinance in a couple of years, is sort of the logic. I mean, that's a big bet, but I don't think it's outlandish either.
Talk to me. So one of the things you and I connect on is books and reading, and for me, it's children's books. And one of the best books I read was a book by David McCullough on the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yes.
And that book discussed and described Brooklyn, essentially all of the boroughs, as separate entities, all to themselves, right? And the bridge connected Manhattan to Brooklyn. Before, they were two completely different ecosystems. In my sort of anecdotal world and seeing this every day, Brooklyn seems to...
The plural of anecdotal is not data.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I have to read through a lot of... With that,
it's deep.
It was.
This interview's done.
No, I'm sorry.
No, it's totally fine. But
then
I started thinking about that. I was like, is that true?
Talk about the caissons too.
We're going to lose everyone if we do the caissons,
Okay.
though they were incredibly riveting.
Yes.
And the guy that fell off.
Understood.
You should join a book club.
No one would sit there with me.
No.
It would just be a lot of me talking. Do you think Brooklyn and Manhattan are different ecosystems for purposes of real estate? And what do you see a future like? In other words, are people more apt to start their first purchase search in Brooklyn rather than Manhattan? Or do you just see sort of two boroughs and the flow is the same for both of them in terms of the market itself?
I see the patterns as pretty similar. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, it's been like 6 or 7 years ago, I was speaking at a Real Deal forum in Shanghai. And not everybody, but a tremendous amount of people were wearing like jackets and clothing that said like London, Paris, Brooklyn.
Wow.
Didn't say Manhattan, right? Wow. So Brooklyn, and 1 out of 4 Americans has an ancestor born in Brooklyn. It has it's clearly different.
Yeah.
It's a different, it appeals to different people. It just is different, but it's morphed from a cheaper place to live than Manhattan to its own thing.
Right.
So I see it as a separate market, but it's still influenced by macroeconomics. The idea that the spike in rates slowed volume, right? Their rents are peaked within 1 month of when Manhattan peaked. So there's a lot of macro parallels in the way markets are performing. The one big difference I would say is when we were looking at during COVID, during the lockdown initially, and then right after it released, Manhattan didn't really wake up. It took about 9 months. It really was seen as ground zero for globally for COVID infections. I mean, my favorite story about this, I say it often, was a friend of mine who's an appraiser in West Texas. Mm-hmm. He said, he's checking in on me because we were like, COVID was raging and there were bodies, in semi-refrigerator, like all that horrible stuff. And he said, boy, I'm in West Texas, in the middle of nowhere. I'm so thankful that'll never happen to me. Within 3 weeks, that was a global hotspot.
Yeah.
So we learned it doesn't matter. But one thing we did learn during COVID is that the outer boroughs behaved better sooner. And I think it was because Manhattan was perceived as this higher density environment. But if you looked at the COVID maps, that the city has posted, during the height of COVID, the highest infection rates were in the outer reaches of Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. Why? Because what do they have in common? They're all suburban-like. So the sort of the high density sort of, label as being, higher risk was not true. There's other reasons, it's more affluent. People were able to leave, right? 40% of the population left. So in many ways, the outer boroughs became a hybrid, whereas Manhattan was sort of the slowest. The outer boroughs were a hybrid, and the suburbs were the Wild West. The renters here fled because they could. No one was selling their homes during COVID. You're going to let a total stranger into your house during a global pandemic, right? Sales fell 50%. But the rental market, people fled and bombarded the suburbs, and prices went through the roof. Bidding wars, 60% of the transactions. So to make a long story short, they're very different, but they still slow down and speed up, much like Manhattan did. And I don't know if there's anything to be learned from that, other than I think pricing in Brooklyn has accelerated faster than Manhattan if you exclude like Billionaires Row, right, and sort of treated as an outlier.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Would you apply the same logic to suburbs? Or has there been a shift back into the city since COVID?
So after 9/11, there was a massive outbound migration. And after 3 years, many did an about face and came back. So I think it's a little too soon. I wouldn't be surprised if it was an overcorrection. But what's changed is that work from home has changed everything. Like within 24 hours, it became ubiquitous in the lockdown. I mean, I moved a half an hour further from the city. Why? Because instead of going in 4 days a week, I go in 1 to 2, because I can work on my computer, my laptop. I have a big screen, I have internet, I have headphones. Like, it kind of works. Right. For in-person meetings, I got to be in the city, right? So I schedule but I think the large number of people are doing that. One of the things right now is that, like if you look at the Castle data on card swipes, we're kind of stuck for office occupancy at about 50%, if you believe that data, right? 50%. But yet housing is, record highs, very robust. So what we learned is that there isn't that as strong a connection between work and home as we thought. Maybe that's just because of work from home, that just changed everything. So the way we're thinking now, I don't think we're done sort of figuring out what this is going to look like. I think we have 5-7 years of turmoil in terms of figuring it out, but I don't think housing is going to have much of a problem. Right now, it's just that mortgage rates are 7.5%.
Do you think that there's any connection in both your points you touched on for a second with the fact that there seems to be almost no inventory in the outlying sort of suburbs? And so the sellers that may be in a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom and just had triplets because of successful IVF decide.
Oh, that's why.
That's
okay.
exactly why.
Got it. Yeah.
And so they can't move to the suburbs because they can't find the house, so they're staying where they are. So that's
correct.
The buyer of the place. So are they connected in that way?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Westchester County, in the third quarter, the most recently completed quarter, had the lowest inventory in history. And my history goes back to 1981.
Wow.
So as a result, bidding wars, meaning properties that the sale price closed higher than the last asking price, is over 50%.
Wow.
And that manifests in your appraisals?
Absolutely. Because half of when you do an appraisal, half of it is, hard data, but sometimes the market's moving faster than the hard data shows. So it also is the narrative. I always liken it to, your best friend is buying a house in Westchester and you're kind of a local, that market, and you sit down at a Starbucks and what do you talk about? well, we bid on this house and there were 5 backup offers, right? That anecdotal that's not in caption and record, you have to tell the story. I like to say, I think I've said this everywhere, so I have to own it, is my wife and I moved last August and we won a 30-way best and final.
Wow.
And only paid 36% over the asking price.
Which is a good price to pay now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, according
You're
to
well
the
known.
Zestimate, my properties were 10% more.
That's amazing.
Of
Do you
cour-
follow Zillow estimates too?
I do for laughs,
That's what,
because you know the story about the Zestimate, right? That they publish on the website, like they publish their stats. So if you just look at national numbers, if the Zestimates are within 2% of what the property's actually worth if it sells, that sounds really good,
yeah.
right? But that's only if it's listed for sale. If it's not listed for sale, oh wait, back up. It's within 2%. The median accuracy rate is 2%. That means half the time it's within 2%, and half the time it's not. So 2% sounds really good, but it's the median accuracy rate, right? Only if it's listed. If it's not listed, the median accuracy rate is 7%. So it's within 7% half the time, and not within 7% the other half the time. I would say that's junk stats. Like if I was held to that standard, I'd be elated. Like, wow, I can be off by 80%, but technically I'm in the other half of the 7%. It's sort of insane, but yet because it's on the internet.
You've
It's
now,
so accessible too.
yeah, he's
it's
just ruined my Sunday morning thing.
Yeah.
Because I thought.
Listen, I've been on the
that
train and people said, yeah, I check my Zestimate every
Exactly.
day. And
Oh, yeah.
and like it went up 1% today. And, it's like.
When it's green, I feel good about myself.
Right.
When it's red, I feel like an idiot.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
So it's been
yeah.
green for a while. I feel really, really
Yeah,
The
yeah,
stock
no.
market.
Yeah, literally. That's what it is.
But it's true. Like when you look at just sort of in aggregate, and there is no national housing market. It's just an aggregate of a zillion
Zilly?
little markets. Housing prices for the last 3 or 4 months are actually rising again, but they're not at pre-pandemic peaks, which brings me up one other point when you talk about markets. Like I'm a big believer in year-over-year comparisons because it's the same season, right?
Mhm.
You're comparing against a spring to a spring, right? You're not comparing a winter to a summer or whatever. But what became necessary over the last couple of years is that when you're comparing year over year, and we had the rate spike, you're comparing against what was a rocket ship.
Right.
So you're like, oh my goodness, prices are down, or prices are down 6%, and sales are down 40%, or whatever the number is, and you're like, that is so distorted.
Would you say that this time, so everyone has this sort of narrative of this time it's different, right? In the stock market, it's always this time is different, and it never really is, right? It really just goes back to an earlier era of what this happened at some point before. Though you bring up a really good point, and what your take on this, we had the rocket ship, but we also, I don't know, of a time where we had interest rates that spiked in the way they did over a short period of time.
They haven't been steeper in 4 decades, like the acceleration of interest rates.
Right. And so what use, is there a use of a year over year comparison then over the past few years or so? Because
There isn't.
Right.
So what I do in all my commentary is compare to pre-pandemic. So I still give year over year and quarter over quarter and all that good stuff. But really what matters to me, it's more telling. I want to know, like if I look at the rental market right now, and rents are coming down a little bit, 4% from peak, but they're in Manhattan, they're 20% higher than pre-pandemic. Now think about that. Pre-pandemic is our most recent report so far is we're coming out with November, so October. So October would be compared to October of 19, which was the last October before the pandemic. We do third quarter, of 23, we're comparing against the third quarter of 19. The only reason for that is you're comparing against sort of stability, not this big distortion caused by the lack of supply. One other thing is that in Manhattan, relative to any other market in the country, as far as I can tell, is that at least the brokerage community, I'm not saying it's in great shape because their volume is down, but relative to any of the suburbs, the outer boroughs, inventory here is sort of, what would you call it, Goldilocks, sort of just right. But the pricing is a little bit of a problem, the new listings coming in. Whereas the rest of the country, Florida's down, 60%, and, California's down like 50% from pre-pandemic.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So
Florida's down 60%?
Yeah. 55 to 60.
Volume.
Number, units of inventory.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So think about that. Like, that means that there's not a lot to sell. So when you say, well, interest rates are causing it, well, I'd say interest rates are half of the story. The other half is there isn't a lot of product. So there's bidding wars and a tremendous amount of competition, which is strange because, you feel, if you're in any industry that touches the housing sector, you feel like you're in a recession. The rest of the economy doesn't feel that way, but we feel that way because it's disproportionately impacted. And one of the reasons is not just rates, but it's the lack of product to sell. And so what we're seeing across the country is certain markets, if you just look at the raw percentages, they have like record share of new development or new construction, not because they built a whole bunch, but because there's like no existing inventory, no resale, are very limited. So instead of being 10 to 15% of the market, new development ends up being, 20 to 30% in a market that's not used to seeing that. And if you think about it, the only way, not the only way, but the way, one of the ways to solve this is to build more housing, right? I mean, that's always the battle cry. And that's something you can do with new construction. I mean, there's a lead time. The problem with the other inventory, which is 88 to 85%, the existing or resale, is it's this living, breathing blob. That's the way you have to think of inventory. That's based on the life stage of the occupant. It's like, that takes time to percolate. Right. And what we had is this tsunami of the Fed keeping rates too low for too long, just obliterated supply, cleared it off the land like it's gone. And I look at markets like Long Island where, inventory right now is not at a record low, but it's like a quarter of what it was at the peak of inventory during the bubble. I mean, like, inventory levels are very low, and because they're very low, and it takes time for that to percolate. Even with inventory rising a bit, it's like going from 1 to 2, or that's 100% increase, right? But it's only one listing, right? I mean, the percentages get really distorted when you're coming from a low number.
And of course, you don't have a crystal ball, but you are very data oriented. Do you think? What would your advice be to a seller, or what would your advice be to a buyer?
So as far as the crystal ball goes, mine's held together with duct tape. And we used a lot of duct tape with my kids growing up.
So you're at an advantage.
So I look at it as, I'm not a big believer in timing. It's more like, these are your needs. You just had twins. You need you don't want to rent anymore, and you're willing to gamble that rates will be lower. So let me talk about that for just a second. Mm-hmm. So the Fed basically has frozen for 2 meetings where they haven't raised rates. I'm a non-economist. I don't know if you told you that.
You tell me you're an
economist. I'm technically not an economist. I'm a non-economist, all right? I could tell you economist jokes and stuff like that, but the consensus has built very much so that they believe that the Fed's going to end up cutting rates. They're going to do 2 rate cuts next year in 24, the first one in June and the next one sometime after that. But by sitting and doing nothing, which is the general feeling that they've done what they need to do, rates are already drifting lower. But realism needs to be sort of factored in here. You have to think of a 3% or a 4% 30-year fixed as an historic anomaly. Mm-hmm. That's not the normal to wish for, and if it happens, we're going to have the same whipsaw thing. We're going to have this explosion. One of the things I learned, I'll get back to my point, but one of the things I learned during this cycle is that unusually low rates make housing less affordable, because it obliterates inventory and bidding wars dominate, and housing prices go up like a rocket ship. I mean, that's what we learned. So instead of being in the mid 7s, if I had to guess, I think through inaction, we'll probably see rates drift into the mid to high 6s. If they do another cut, by the middle of next year, my assumption, or let's be realistic, let's call it a wild guess, is if they cut rates, there's going to be a disproportionately high reaction to it, because the rate pivot a year and a half ago sort of interrupted this rocket ship. And I still feel like there's a tremendous incentive or urgency to buy for people that were interrupted, and now they're priced out because of the rates. I think you're going to see a lot of sort of making up for the missed opportunity, even though rates, I think in the long run, my wild guess would be that they're going to end up stabilizing in the high 5s, and that's going to be where it's going to be, and that's going to be the standard, and good. 2 years ago, when rates were ridiculously low, I was actually saying rates should be in the 5s. Like that, like 3s and 4s felt, I don't know, like we're poaching demand from the future. Yeah. And that relates to your suburban comparison, is that, typically, and I was one of these people where my wife was pregnant, we had a baby, and then she was pregnant a second time, and then we decided to move to Connecticut. And that's actually a trackable phenomenon in the population, that people, couples move to the suburbs, become first-time buyers. And what we did is we took 5 years of demand after the lockdown, and it compressed it into like 3 months. So everybody who would have, over maybe a 5-year window, did it like in 3 months, and it just walloped the suburbs. And so that's going to slow down, because we already saw it. Right. Sort of the migration to the suburbs to become first-time buyers and have kids and raise them, and with lawns and shrubbery and all that sort of thing.
Yes. To your point,
that was one sentence, by the way.
That was a beautiful sentence.
It was great.
It's very smooth. To your point, something you brought up, and you brought up earlier, and I'd like to bring up, is you bring up an awesome point where we probably, and this is again my personal opinion, but we probably have the narrative online and social media is, as soon as rates fall, prices will go up, and there's going to be tons of demand. A Shark Tank judge said this.
Yes, which we know they're experts in what they used to be 20 years ago, and now they're still experts. How does that work?
I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's a very weird dynamic to me, because I think it's completely wrong. That's to presuppose that prices have the ability to move up from where they are right now. And I think part of what we're seeing
is we've reached an affordability threshold where people, and that's my belief, especially in the rental market, where it's just, you've reached a resistance point, and I think, we started seeing that, probably in the spring. So it's what I see is just the opposite of that point of view. Is you want to, the million or billion or $1 trillion question is how do you get more inventory to come into the market out of on the resale? Falling rates bring, so, if I'm at 4% as a homeowner and I'm kind of thinking about, moving or for whatever reason, think of, my rate is 4% and the current rate, let's call it 7.5%. Every notch that the interest rates come down, it reduces the spread, or in my parlance, the resistance to going on the market. It doesn't cause an avalanche of demand, but you're compressing, so you're making it easier on top of time passing. And you've had triplets in the one bedroom, right? To make a move. So I think the only way inventory is going to really return to the market is if the spread net continues to narrow. What that's going to do is that's going to bring more supply in, and it's going to actually cause prices to level off or slip, or just stay flat and not rise anymore. Right. Because I imagine that that rise in inventory is going to be very gradual because rates aren't going to correct. Right, is my belief. They're maybe going to slip a little bit, but there's not a correction in store, at least in my take. So the idea that prices are going to go through the roof is kind of silly, because the demand is caused by the lower rates, but it also, it's not one side of the equation. It's not just buyers that are impacted, it's sellers, the ones that are sort of the key to this sort of housing impasse right now.
And so on the contrary, do you think pricing will correct?
No. The reason is that I think, listen, if rates collapse to 3% overnight, inventory would flood the market, and you could see prices fall. But what's different in this cycle, unlike the housing bubble, is there is no financial engineering. In fact, credit conditions in this cycle, banks never lost their mind. And I think that's a huge thing. Like we're not, and in fact, since rates have been rising, credit has gotten a lot tighter. It is not financially engineered. It's actually good old fashioned underwriting. Yeah, on the margin, there's some dumb stuff always, but generally conditions, banks in my you probably know better than me, like banks in some, transactions are looking for ways to get out of the deal.
In an overwhelming number of transactions compared to what we saw previously, at least for me, a bank is saying no way more than it ever did.
Because they're being much more conservative. And so we're not going to have like a banking system failure like we did during the housing bubble, because banks never lost their mind. Like literally all during the pandemic, Wall Street analysts that I friendly with were basically telling me that credit conditions, and you can look at the Fed metrics that they track, were, if you take the 3 decades prior to the housing bubble and call that a normal period where it was boring, right? It wasn't these big swings. Credit conditions during the pandemic were like 20% tighter. So there isn't that sort of concern in this cycle. Whereas the last cycle, you just had to have a pulse, right, or fog a mirror. And even then, you can still get a loan, like literally, right? Yeah. And there's nothing like that. But I think many people were that was the impression of sort of what it looks like when you go into a recession or, and that's why I don't even think this is contagious.
This is an ancillary question, but something Sharon and I talk about quite often is we track the number of deals on a weekly basis, and the amount of cash that we've seen in terms of transactions is like something that we've never seen before. We've tracked it for 3 months, so that's not shocking. Mm-hmm. But
you've been around for more than 3 months or 6 months.
We've been around for longer, but we've been tracking for 6 months.
There we go. So when we look at that and we tie in, maybe you can touch upon this, what I am looking at, which is essentially the greatest generational transfer of wealth in human history, where parents are buying for their many times adult children in very expensive sort of places.
Yeah.
Is that stopping prices from falling, or does not really play a role too much and it's really just around the edges?
At least now it seems on the margin, but it certainly could. I mean, what I think of is like the suburbs and all the houses that baby boomers own, and many are tear downs because the scale of a new house is so much different than a house built in the 60s, right? I'm not saying every baby boomer's house is going to be torn down or anything like that, but I'm just saying like it's an odd sort of period, and wealth transformation is a big. Is that transformation or transfer?
You can have transformative wealth, which I don't have, but you can have a transference of wealth. Which
transference. Okay, that's the word I'm looking for. I think that's part of it.
You make this about you.
I always do.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
That's really my podcast.
But
You're self-made.
yeah, so yeah, I do think it is, but I completely forgot the point I was going to make.
There was none.
There was none?
No.
Okay.
No, there was nothing.
It's rare that I'm speechless.
This is the value that I bring.
You absolutely do. You try to stump the guest.
It was more about do these parents that are buying for their kids, are they artificially keeping prices
disrupting
high?
the market?
Are they disrupting the market? Should they stay out of it in any way whatsoever?
Well, if you're those kids, you don't want them to stay out of it.
No, we don't want them to stay out of it.
No.
Very jealous. And yeah, there's nothing you can say to take them out of it, right? I don't. So I guess my initial take is probably not keeping prices higher. I think it's more about lack of supply than anything else. So, I mean, theoretically, it's certainly possible, but I think it's more current. It's the lack of supply right now. It's not a generational phenomenon. But
from a supply perspective, are you seeing a lot of fixer-uppers? In other words, are buyers becoming less picky about what they're purchasing just because inventory is so low?
So that's a natural expectation. That's a really good point. But I'm not seeing it as sort of a dominant feature of the market. We are seeing it, but I just remember periods in the past, like in the early 90s, it seemed like every other listing was a fixer-upper.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not seeing that now. And that may be a choice of, I'm thinking like what property actually comes on, or people doing work to their places before, and so there's a better quality product entering the market. I'm not really sure, but I don't see, but I expect to see much more of it going forward. Like that's something that I think is reasonable to expect. However, with limited inventory, the problem is the sort of the spread between a renovated and an unrenovated is still generally much higher than the cost, or not the cost, but like the pain in the neck component to it. So I don't know how much upside there will be.
In terms of volume, so one of the last things I sort of want to touch upon is volume for the new year, right? Because our business, your business, the brokers that we work with, their business is, yes, it's based on the price, sure, but really it's based on the volume in the market
itself. It's a transactional business.
It's a transactional business. Do you see volume sort of staying in this area for the next year or so, given the forces that are weighing on the market itself, the interest rates, the lack of affordability, the lack of inventory? Do you see it gradually going up? I mean, what's your broken crystal ball?
I see more transaction volume in 2024, 10, 15% more maybe, maybe even more.
State college.
Actually, my college is known for inventing chocolate cheese. I don't want to brag.
Didn't know there was chocolate cheese.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of keep to ourselves.
All right, that's probably rightfully so. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason for that is I think there's going to be a sort of a slow motion downward trajectory in rates over the course of 24, barring some crazy, thing like a federal election or
Worldwide plague.
Worldwide. Well, we
Worldwide war.
yeah. Apparently, we didn't call a pandemic. We didn't see it coming.
No, we had no idea.
So now,
who could have known?
Who would have known, right? But I do think, first of all, there's this. I think of my kids. 3 of them have, bought and sold houses. The other one's renting in the city, living his best life that I aspire to have. But they all said, like when they bought, well, I shouldn't say that. The one that bought last, who has a 4%, he got a 4, just, now it'd be 7.5, whatever. But when he got a 4, it was seen as high because it wasn't 2.75 or 3 like his other brother got when he bought, the year before. And his comment to me was, in a couple of years, rates will be a little bit lower, I'll refi. and like,
you didn't say anything?
Well, my kids are smarter than me. So, but I hear that a lot. And it is a big gamble. Like you're talking about this biggest asset purchase of your career or your life, probably. But there is that general expectation. Now, fast forward to when you read the news every day, there's an expectation of visceral across the economy that the Fed is going to cut rates. Their next rate change is going to be a cut. Whether or not that happens is another story, but there's an expectation. And I think that'll also elevate sort of, taking that risk calculation a little bit more. It's less intimidating and, hey, make the higher payments for a couple of years. I'm not saying everybody can afford to do that, but I'm just saying it increases the probability of more activity.
One last thing for you that I want to sort of touch upon where you mentioned this.
Second to last thing.
Second to last thing.
Because I have to read Daniel's question verbatim.
Okay.
Oh,
yes, that's right. That's good. The second to last question is, you mentioned this as an asset, right? And most people think of it as their largest asset. This is more your take on this. Since 94, were people considering their homes as assets? And I say this from personal experience, where my relationship with my home, yes, I feel great that I got it by chance in 2020 at a 2.5% mortgage rate. It's going through my skill in picking.
Yeah, not to rub that in.
But whatever. But my relationship with it has changed, less so of an asset, more so of like, oh, this is my home. This is where I'm raising my kids. This is where I live. I'm not necessarily trading it as I would shares of Tesla or something else.
Right.
Have you seen, or witnessed this sort of difference in the way people view these places essentially as assets rather than what they were? Or am I just thinking of this like ridiculous romanticized version of,
Well, I think you came up with this question when you were raking leaves.
That's correct. For 6 hours.
Right. So,
how to do it.
So I don't ascribe to that theory at all.
Yeah.
And the reason I don't is because we've already done it. So during the housing bubble, 07-ish, 08-ish, that era, housing was seen as a stock. It was seen as, you watch the ticker.
Right.
And that's how it was thought. It was thought of as, and it was high. It was much more liquid than it was before because there were no underwriting standards, right? Again, we joked earlier, like you have a pulse or fog and mirror, like that was the prevailing. So like you could get in and out, whereas it's not really that kind of asset. So I feel like after the insanity of the housing bubble and the liar loans and all that stuff, and not factoring in, hey, if you throw like bad assets into a AAA rated portfolio, it doesn't have any impact, right? That was literally what the rating agents would say. All that stuff is like a bad memory. And I feel like, my observation is that we've returned to more sanity. I don't see it. I think consumers are more educated or informed than they were 20, 30 years ago. But I still think they see it as, a home. or it's not just a cold piece of steel that they're investing in.
You
Okay.
have a final question, Sharon.
Ready? I'm going to read this for you.
All right.
Why are appraisers bad at accepting large envelopes of cash?
There's a second part.
What can brokers do to change that?
Right. Okay. So yeah. So
We should have led with this, and I'm sorry.
right now it's okay. Yeah, you're talking about being morally flexible as an
Exactly.
industry.
Beautiful way.
I just want to note that
That's
Daniel,
Dan's question.
That's an
Good
OG.
question.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, if you think about it, the appraiser in a transaction is the last one to the party. Everybody in the transaction knows the answer already, right? They know the number. The appraiser's coming in cold. The buyer's attorney, the seller's attorney, the title company, the engineer, the seller, the buyer's broker, the seller's broker. Like, there's this whole group of people that are compensated by largely a successful transfer of the property. The appraiser gets paid whether that happens or not. So we don't care.
right?
And so that makes us, it makes us sort of, the subject of, irritation when deals are, whatever, don't work out or the appraiser doesn't agree. The part that I always have to remind people is that when we do the appraisal, we're not doing it for anybody that's right there. We're doing it for the bank
Right.
to assess the collateral, to figure out whether they should help them make an informed lending decision. And that's what was one of the problems during the financial crisis, is the sales function, the loan officers had much more control than the underwriters, the sort of Q&A, right? And so, the only appraisers that could make a living were the ones that were morally flexible.
Mm-hmm.
And I really thought in 2005 that we were going to be out of business in 3 years because all my peers, who, by the way, are all gone out of business, all my peers were morally flexible.
Wow.
And so I remember this in 2005, that's why I started blogging, actually, is because how do I tell people this? This sort of, no one really wants the number. They just we want appraisers to be deal enablers instead of, independent arbiters of value. And in 2005, CNBC, I wrote a bunch of stuff in my blog, Matrix, for the first time. I launched it, and CNBC saw it, came to my office, and interviewed me. And I said 75% of the paper that appraisers are written on, and that's quaint because it's all PDFs now, but 85% of the paper that's being used for appraisals, the appraisals aren't worth the paper they're written on, 75%.
Wow.
And my peers, who were all gone, all said, sour grapes, you're just not getting the volume, all this stuff is like, and then 3 years later, Lehman happened. CNBC played the clip and said, here's someone that told us what was going to happen 3 years ago. And all of a sudden I'm a genius, right? I'm the same person, but I was an idiot because I didn't make the number. And now I'm a genius because we didn't make the number before because we knew, what the data was showing us. So anyway, that's my.
One quick follow-up to that.
Okay.
We're very
I
statistic
thought I was
oriented.
off the hook.
Yeah, no.
One
not yet.
quick one. Statistically, how many of your properties underappraise, overappraise, or appraise at value?
That's a good high five.
I feel like
wish
this
I
is
had
like 2 against 1.
Well, I'm just saying. I wish I had that one written.
So I would say it depends.
That's a good one too. You're doing great.
What
Just getting
a
into
lawyer
it. Yeah.
response.
Because it's not always the same. Sometimes it's a little more than others. I would say probably like low single digit, like 1%. And there's always a really obvious reason. You know, like if something sold for $14.2 million, the data isn't precise enough to come in at 14,150.
Right.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't exist. It's like my parents when they bought a house in the suburbs of Boston when I was a little kid, they paid like $19,425, right? So the appraiser probably didn't come in at $19,400
Right.
if they were to kill the deal. Like there isn't that precision. But you know, you can have, you know, we've had things where, you know, it comes in, you know, it's in contract for 2, you know, and maybe it's worth $1.3 million. Like it's way off.
Got it.
It tends to be more about deals that are way off as opposed to very nuanced.
Makes perfect sense.
Dan, Miller time. Jonathan Miller.
Thank
You so much.
Oh,
for
my
being
pleasure.
Here.
I come here for the water.
And then it's reverse osmosis,
Okay.
and I understand why. So thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for being awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.